In 1915, Britain promised Palestine to the Arabs. In 1916, it secretly promised the same land to France. In 1917, it promised it again, this time to the Jewish people. 3 promises, 1 piece of land. Britain never planned to keep all 3. To understand this, you need to go back to 1914. World War I had just started. By November of that year, the Ottoman Empire had joined the war on Germany's side. That single decision put Palestine, Syria, and Iraq directly on the front line of a European war, 3 regions that had lived under Ottoman rule for 4 centuries. Britain didn't just want to beat Germany, it wanted the Ottoman Empire gone for good. The Suez Canal ran through Egypt, and it was Britain's lifeline to India. Losing control of that route wasn't an option. Every ship carrying troops, grain, or gold between London and the East had to pass through it. Protecting that canal shaped almost every decision Britain made in the region for the next 4 years. It's the single fact that explains why a small desert territory like Palestine suddenly mattered so much to an empire fighting a war thousands of miles away in the trenches of France. So Britain started making deals, lots of them, and here's the detail most people miss: the men negotiating these deals barely talked to each other. They worked out of different offices, answered to different ministers, and often had no idea what the others had already agreed to. The Foreign Office ran one set of negotiations, the India Office ran another, military intelligence in Cairo ran a third. Different offices, different priorities, same land, promised 3 separate times. That's where the story really begins. By mid-1915, Britain was losing ground at Gallipoli. Tens of thousands of soldiers were dying for barely any territory, and the campaign was turning into a humiliating stalemate. London needed a new front against the Ottomans fast. So British officials in Cairo reached out to Sharif Hussein, the ruler of Mecca, and a man with real religious authority across the Arab world, as a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Their offer was simple: rise up against the Ottomans, and Britain will back an independent Arab state. Over 10 months, Hussein and the British High Commissioner Henry McMahon traded 10 letters. In October 1915, McMahon wrote that Britain was ready to recognize Arab independence across huge stretches of the Middle East. It sounded like a real commitment, but the wording left room to argue. Certain regions were excluded for reasons that were never fully explained. Nobody defined the borders with any precision, and whether Palestine itself was actually included in that promise. That question would haunt British diplomacy for decades, and historians are still arguing about it today. Some later British officials insisted Palestine had never been part of the deal. Others admitted privately that it clearly had been. Hussein believed Palestine was included. He launched the Arab Revolt in 1916 on that belief, sending his own sons into battle against Ottoman forces, supported by British officers including the man later known as Lawrence of Arabia. Thousands of Arab fighters died in a brutal desert campaign. But while Hussein was preparing to fight, and while his men were dying for a promise he thought was solid, London was making a very different deal behind his back. In May 1916, 2 diplomats, Britain's Mark Sykes and France's François Georges, Picot, signed a secret agreement with Russia's approval. It carved up the Ottoman Middle East between the British and French empires, drawn out on a map with a ruler and a colored pencil in rooms Hussein never saw. Britain would control areas around Iraq. France would take Syria and Lebanon, and Palestine. It was marked out for some form of international administration, controlled by neither power outright, with the exact arrangement left deliberately vague. This agreement directly contradicted what Britain had just promised Hussein. Arab fighters were dying for independence, while the men in London had already quietly split their homeland between two European powers. Hussein didn't know this deal existed. Almost nobody did. It stayed secret for over a year, until Russian revolutionaries seized power, found the agreement in the old Tsarist archives, and published it specifically to embarrass Britain and France. But this is only two promises. A third one was coming, and it would be the one that changed history. What no one expected was who Britain would turn to next. By 1917, the war had reached a breaking point. Russia was collapsing into revolution, and its army was falling apart on the Eastern Front. If Russia dropped out of the war entirely, Germany could move its eastern armies west and threaten to overwhelm Britain and France before American troops arrived in any real numbers. The United States had just entered the war in April, but its soldiers were still months away from reaching Europe. Britain's new Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, wanted every possible advantage he could find on every front, financial, political, and psychological. One man saw an opening. Chaim Weizmann, a chemist and leading Zionist based in Manchester, had spent years building relationships with British officials, including Balfour himself, whom he'd first met back in 1906. Weizmann and fellow Zionist leader Nahum Sokolow argued that a British promise to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine could rally Jewish opinion across America and Russia behind the Allied war effort at the exact moment Britain needed that support most. Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, already personally sympathetic to Zionism, took the idea to the War Cabinet in the summer of 1917. For months, the cabinet argued over the exact wording. Every phrase mattered. Every word would be read by Arabs, by French officials watching their own claims in the region, and by Jewish communities around the world, all searching the text for what it meant for them. Cabinet ministers debated draft after draft, softening some language, sharpening other parts, fully aware that whatever they published couldn't be taken back. On November 2, 1917, Balfour signed a short letter addressed to Lord Rothschild, a leader of Britain's Jewish community. It was barely 125 words long, but those words would reshape the Middle East for the next century. The letter said Britain viewed, in its own words, with favor, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It promised Britain would use its best efforts to make that happen. And then it added a condition that nothing would be done to harm the civil and religious rights of Palestine's non-Jewish communities, who at the time made up the vast majority of the population, living there close to 90%. The declaration became public a week later, printed in newspapers across Britain and around the world. For Zionist leaders, it was the moment they'd worked toward for decades. For Arab leaders who'd trusted McMahon's promise just 2 years earlier, it read like a betrayal in plain sight. Here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. Britain didn't even control Palestine when it made this promise. The Ottomans still ruled it. British troops wouldn't take Jerusalem for another 5 weeks. Britain was promising land it hadn't conquered yet, to a population that made up less than 10% of the people already living there, while having already promised the same land to 2 other parties entirely. This is the moment the 3 promises collided, and Britain never publicly resolved the contradiction. It just moved forward, betting the details could be worked out later. They couldn't. By the end of 1918, Britain and its allies had defeated the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was now Britain's to govern. In 1920, the Allied powers met at San Remo and folded the Balfour Declaration directly into international law. 2 years after that, the League of Nations made it official, handing Britain a mandate over Palestine built directly on Balfour's promise. Arab leaders protested almost immediately. They pointed back to McMahon's letters and asked why that promise had been quietly abandoned while Balfour's had become official policy. Britain never gave a clean answer. Officials argued for years over whether Palestine had truly been included in the Hussein Agreement in the first place. That argument was never fully settled, and it still shapes how each side remembers this history. The contradiction didn't stay theoretical for long. Jewish immigration to Palestine grew steadily through the 1920s and sharply after the rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The Arab population, watching its position in its own homeland shift under policies it had never agreed to, responded with growing protest. By 1936, that tension exploded into a full uprising against British rule, one that took years and tens of thousands of troops for Britain to put down. By the time the Second World War ended, Britain was exhausted financially and politically, and Palestine had become close to ungovernable. In 1947, Britain finally handed the entire problem to the newly formed United Nations and withdrew. The following year, in May of 1948, the State of Israel declared its independence. Chaim Weizmann, the man who had lobbied for that 125-word letter 3 decades earlier, became its first president. What started as 3 wartime promises, made by different British offices for different strategic reasons, became the foundation for one of the long-running conflicts of the modern era. The letter that Balfour signed in just 125 words is still cited today in speeches, in legal arguments, in history classrooms. Over a century after he wrote it, remember that map from the beginning. Those 3 overlapping claims never went away. They just moved from paper into reality, and they're still being contested right now. Britain made these promises to win a war. It never fully answered for what came after. If you want to understand how the Sykes-Picot Agreement carved up the rest of the Middle East, that's a story on its own, and it's just as messy as this one. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this into the decisions that quietly built the world we live in now.